They cut my water line. Not accidentally. Not a leak. They dug it up and sealed it shut, all because a power-hungry HOA board member named Karen decided my green garden hose didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. What she didn't know, I own the well. I built the system. And her precious HOA. They've been drinking from my infrastructure for over a decade. So when she crossed the line, literally, I did what any landowner with a backbone and a deed would do. I turned the valve, and I watched her kingdom dry up. This is the story of how one Karen's thirst for control cost her everything, and how I reminded a whole neighborhood who really held the power. Stay to the end, it doesn't just end in revenge. It ends in restoration. They say you never truly know your neighbors until something goes wrong. And let me tell you, nothing went wrong faster than the day I got that letter from the HOA. A bright yellow violation notice slapped onto my front door like some kind of public shaming scroll, flapping in the early morning breeze. The offense: aesthetic inconsistency due to unauthorized faucet extension and non-regulation hose fixture visible from curbside view. Translation: Karen didn't like my garden hose. I stared at the letter for a long moment, blinking through the sunlight, my coffee cooling in my hand. The unauthorized fixture was a green rubber hose I'd had for 3 years, looped neatly on a steel holder just below the front spigot tucked beside my flower beds. It had watered my begonias and tomatoes since I moved here. No one had ever said a word about it until now. I looked across the street. Karen was standing on her porch, red blazer, sunglasses on, arms folded like a prison warden. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, just turned and walked inside, leaving her front door half open like an invitation or a warning. I knew her type the moment she moved in 6 months ago. She didn't just join the HOA board, she took it over. Got herself elected vice chair within 2 weeks, rewrote the lawn maintenance guidelines within 1 month, called a special vote to ban solar panels for uniformity's sake, and now apparently she was inspecting individual water fixtures. Is this seriously happening? I muttered, walking back inside. I called the HOA office first thing. Got transferred 3 times before a woman named Cheryl answered, sounding tired and over-caffeinated. Yes, Mr. Landon. I see the notice here says your hose holder and faucet extension were reported by board member Karen Wexler last Tuesday. Reported for what exactly? She said the fixture is non-compliant with Section 4.6 front-facing hardware visibility standards. I laughed. I couldn't help it. So now my hose is a crime, sir. I just read what's on the system. If you'd like to appeal, you can attend next week's hearing or remove the fixture before then. I hung up without another word. That afternoon, I walked the block with my phone camera. 9 other homes had visible hoses. Some were bright blue. One had a rusty pipe sticking out with 2 different valves taped together. Not a single one had a violation notice on their door. It was personal. Karen had made me a target. She didn't know who she was dealing with. What Karen didn't know, what most of this neighborhood didn't know, was that I wasn't just some retired engineer living out my days tending tomatoes. I'd built this land, literally. Before this neighborhood existed, this was all part of my family's ranch. My father sold the northern half to developers under one condition: that we'd retain full control of the original groundwater well system. The HOA got water rights through an easement, but I still owned the underlying infrastructure. That well, that pump station, and that main valve mine. I maintained it myself, quietly, privately, legally. And yet here I was getting flagged for a faucet. 3 days later, I walked out to my yard and noticed something strange. The hose was gone. Not stolen. Removed. Cut. The metal holder was on the ground, ripped from the bolts. The faucet line had been capped with a plastic fitting, like some amateur plumber tried to seal it without telling me. I bent down and saw the dirt disturbed. Fresh shovel marks someone had dug. I followed the disturbed line across my flower bed, and there it was, a square of sod rolled back like a flap. Underneath a shallow trench, my water line exposed, and the pipe itself cut clean with a hacksaw capped with what looked like a glue-on plug from a hardware store. They didn't even try to hide it. I stood there, hands shaking, not in fear, but in the kind of fury that only comes when someone violates something sacred. Not just my plumbing, not just my yard, but my rights, my dignity. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't yell or storm into their office. I went inside. I opened my filing cabinet, and I pulled out a copy of the original land deed and the easement agreement. 2 hours later, I sent an email. Short, cold, surgical. To HOA Board. Subject property violation and water interference. Dear Board, I have discovered that my private water line was tampered with, dug up, and cut without consent. As the legal owner of the originating water infrastructure and provider of easement-based supply to the HOA's distribution grid, I consider this not only a property violation, but also a breach of easement terms. I will be conducting a full review of the mainline valve system this weekend. Please consider this your formal notice. Mason Landon. I didn't expect them to understand what that meant, but Karen would soon learn. You don't mess with a man's water and expect the river to keep flowing. The next morning I woke up to silence. No hum from the refrigerator, no gentle churning of the dishwasher I'd set the night before. When I turned on the kitchen faucet to rinse out my coffee pot, nothing came out but a hollow gurgle like the pipes were trying to spit, but had gone dry overnight. I checked the bathroom sink. Same thing. Shower bone dry. Toilets wouldn't flush, not even a drip. I stepped outside, still barefoot, the morning sun barely cresting over the rooftops. My neighbor, Mrs. Ortega, was walking her schnauzer. I waved her down. Hey, Rosa, your water working? She blinked. Yeah, fine. I just filled Buddy's bowl. Why no reason? I said, forcing a smile. Just checking. So it was just me. Again. I headed around the side of the house toward the cut-off valve box near the sidewalk. I'd buried the main junction years ago beneath a metal plate hidden under some mulch and river stones. I pulled the cover and stared at the freshly patched PVC. Still damp. A cheap plastic cap jammed onto the end of the pipe with blue primer dripping off the threads. Same type of hack job I saw yesterday. But this wasn't just sabotage. This was trespassing. Malicious intent. Vandalism. I took pictures. Every angle. Time-stamped. Then I pried the cap off and reached into my toolbox to reattach a temporary joint. I had spare couplings and valves for situations just like this. But something stopped me. A low burning voice inside me said, don't fix it yet. Make them see what they've done. Instead of patching the pipe, I left it exposed and walked down to the pump house at the edge of the property. Most people didn't know it existed. Hidden behind a line of hedges and a faded wooden gate. The building was no bigger than a garden shed, but inside was the beating heart of the water system, pressure gauges, filtration, a buried wellhead, and 2 mainline valves. One valve fed my property, the other fed the HOA. I checked the readings. My line showed 0 pressure, obviously. But the HOA feed was humming along. Still full. Still pressurized, still pulling from my well. They had cut my access, but kept taking from the source I maintained. I stared at the second valve. My hand hovered over it. Not yet. I wanted them to sweat first. I drove straight to the HOA office at 9 a.m. violation letter in hand. A teenage assistant greeted me at the desk, fumbling with the phone and trying not to make eye contact. Is Karen in? I asked. She's in a meeting, he replied, eyes darting to the office door behind him. Well, tell her Mason Landon's here, and that he brought photos. 2 minutes later, Karen emerged, perfectly composed, red lipstick, clipboard in hand. That same tailored red blazer like it was part of a costume. Mr. Landon, she said coolly. How can I help you? I held up my phone and flicked through the images. Recognize this, my water line was cut. Again. Capped illegally. Someone dug through my yard and sealed off my system without notice or authorization. She didn't even flinch. Just blinked once, slow and deliberate. Per Section 7.1 of the HOA Landscape Improvement Guidelines, any unregistered plumbing that crosses common view areas must be reviewed for code compliance. That pipe has been there for 10 years. But not reviewed, she said. We had concerns it could be a cross-connection risk. Our landscaping vendor was instructed to make corrections for safety. You're calling this safety, I hissed. You vandalized private property. We protected the neighborhood, she said, raising her voice just slightly for the others in the office to hear. From non-compliant infrastructure. I stepped closer. You realize I own the easement this neighborhood depends on, right? The water rights, the pump, the infrastructure, everything feeding your compliant home's all mine. Now she flinched, just a little. You're bluffing. I pulled the folded deed from my coat pocket. The original notarized land transfer agreement from 15 years ago. I tapped the line near the bottom, where it read, Grantor retains ownership of water source pump station and service access. Grantee HOA is extended non-exclusive utility easement conditional on maintenance cooperation. Karen scanned it quickly, the blood draining from her face. But she didn't speak. I leaned in and whispered, You cut my access and kept the HOAs flowing. You violated the easement. I have every right to terminate service. Her voice cracked as she replied, You wouldn't dare. I smiled. I haven't yet. Back home, I sat on the porch and waited. By noon, I had 4 calls from the HOA office. I ignored them. At 2:15, Karen left a voicemail, Mr. Landon, please return our call. The board would like to discuss this civilly before any rash action is taken. At 4 p.m., I drove back to the pump house. I unlocked the hatch. The valve felt stiff from disuse, but I turned it slowly, just a quarter turn. Then another. Then, click. The pressure gauge dropped like a stone. 10 minutes later, I sat back down on my porch with a sweet tea and waited. And waited. Then the neighborhood started to react. Sprinklers sputtered to a stop. Kids with water balloons screamed as nothing came out of the spigots. A neighbor walked out, holding a dripping mop, confused. Someone yelled from a few houses down. What the hell happened to the water? I didn't move, didn't say a word. Then Karen came flying around the corner in her Lexus SUV Hair Wild phone to her ear. She pulled into my driveway and got out like a tornado. You cut the water. No, I said calmly. I shut off the source. It's my system. You severed my access, so I exercised my right to review usage. People have no water. Neither did I. For 2 days. Her face twisted into something between rage and disbelief. You can't just, I said, and I will. Until this board acknowledges what it did, repairs my line, and issues a formal apology. She didn't reply, just got back in the car and sped off. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the silence settle around me like mist. It was the sweetest silence I'd heard in months. By morning, the neighborhood was in a mild state of chaos. I watched from my porch as 2 teenage kids lugged buckets from a kiddie pool to flush their toilet. A minivan parked sideways across the street while its driver screamed into a phone. Sprinkler systems were dead silent. Lawns were already beginning to dry out, especially Karen's precious front hedge, trimmed weekly like it was her crown jewel. And still, not a single board member had knocked on my door with anything resembling accountability. That was fine. I'd given them a chance. But by 9:00 a.m., an email finally pinged into my inbox from the HOA General Account subject line. Urgent maintenance notice, temporary water outage. I clicked it open and nearly laughed out loud. Dear residents, we are currently experiencing an unexpected water service interruption due to routine maintenance being conducted on neighborhood supply infrastructure. Our vendors are working quickly to restore full functionality. We appreciate your patience and understanding. HOA Board of Directors, routine maintenance. They were blaming me while pretending they were handling it. I checked the sender's signature block. Karen Wexler, Vice Chair. She wasn't just lying, she was doubling down. Hoping no one would ask questions, hoping I would be too afraid or too tired to respond. I cracked my knuckles and started typing. Subject re-urgent, maintenance, notice. To the board. Please be advised that no maintenance is being conducted. The water outage currently impacting the HOA's service grid is the direct result of a legal suspension of supply from the source pump system, which I own and operate under private infrastructure and easement terms established in 2009. The outage is not due to maintenance, it is due to violation. Namely, the unauthorized and unlawful tampering of my private water line, which was cut, capped, and trespassed upon by individuals acting under the HOA's direction without notice, hearing, or consent. I will consider restoring water once the following are met. 1. My property line is repaired to its prior condition at the HOA's expense. 2. A written apology is issued and entered into the board minutes. 3. A permanent record is placed restricting any future action against my property without legal counsel present. Until then, I suggest you inform residents that the outage is due to board mismanagement, not maintenance. Cordially, Mason Landon, I hit send. Then I picked up my coffee and took a long sip. The phone rang within 5 minutes. I let it go to voicemail. By noon, HOA President Greg Wilkins finally appeared. Middle-aged, tired, the kind of man who took the job because no one else wanted it. He wore a wrinkled polo shirt and khakis and knocked gently, like he was afraid I might have set traps. I opened the door and didn't invite him in. "Mason," he began. "Mind if we talk? You can talk right there," I said, stepping onto the porch. He glanced behind him like he didn't want to be seen. "Look, this whole thing's gotten out of hand. Karen told us there was a safety concern with your water line. Something about unapproved plumbing and risk of backflow. She lied." He nodded once. I figured. "So what now?" I asked. Greg pulled a folded packet from his back pocket. "She didn't tell us you still owned the water system. We assumed the HOA had full control since the merger. She assumed wrong. You'd know that if you ever read the original agreement." "We looked at it this morning," he admitted. "It's airtight. You've got every right to shut it off. But we're asking you not to punish the whole neighborhood." "I'm not punishing the neighborhood," I said. "I'm defending my property from an authoritarian HOA member who decided her power extended into my soil." He took a deep breath. "Can we make this right? You can start by removing the cap, repairing my pipe, and putting in writing that what happened was unauthorized and won't happen again. I'll need board approval for that," he said. "You'll get it." He hesitated. "And if I do, water comes back within the hour." He nodded again. "I'll call an emergency meeting. Just please don't let this go on longer than it needs to." I didn't promise him anything, but I saw something in his eyes that wasn't there before. A little fear, a little respect. By late afternoon, the HOA board called a special session. I wasn't invited, of course, but that was fine. I didn't want a seat at their folding table circus. I just wanted justice. What I did get, though, was an email sent quietly without fanfare. "Subject Restoration Plan Approval, Mr. Landon. The board has reviewed your claim and acknowledges that a miscommunication and oversight occurred during recent landscaping adjustments. We apologize for the disruption to your property and have instructed our maintenance team to fully restore your water line and landscape immediately at HOA expense. We also affirm that no further action will be taken involving your property without direct written approval. Thank you for your past contributions to this community. Greg Wilkins, HOA President, no mention of Karen. No public admission of guilt, but I knew." And that was enough for now. I waited until the last light of day stretched across the street before I walked down to the pump house one final time. Crickets chirped. Sprinklers sat dead and lifeless across manicured lawns. I opened the hatch, twisted the valve slowly, and let the water flow again. Within minutes, the pressure gauge surged. A deep humming thrum rose through the pipes like a heartbeat, restarting after flatline. I walked home in the dark, listening to the faint hiss of hoses and irrigation coming back to life across the neighborhood. And when I turned on the kitchen faucet that night, clean water splashed into the sink like it had never left. But I knew things had changed. Karen had crossed a line, and now her grip on this neighborhood was starting to slip. 2 days after the water came back, my line was finally restored, well, halfway. A young contractor in a neon vest showed up just after 9 a.m. in a dusty HOA-branded pickup. He knocked once, then started pacing my lawn like he didn't want to be there. His name was Chase, early 20s, polite, visibly nervous. He carried a shovel in one hand and a clipboard in the other, like one could protect him from the other. "I'm here to fix your line, sir. They told me to, keep you informed of everything I do." I nodded and offered him a bottle of cold water. He smiled, relaxed a little. "You the guy who shut off the whole block?" I smiled back, just defending my ground. He grinned, then knelt to begin digging up the capped pipe they'd butchered. I stood nearby, arms folded, watching as he unearthed the damage. The cut was jagged. The fitting they'd slapped on was the kind you use in irrigation systems for rental properties, not something rated for permanent household use. No permit, no inspection, and no care. Whoever had done it wasn't just reckless. They were vindictive. "This was no landscaping accident," I said mostly to myself. Chase looked up. "Honestly, sir, I don't think it was. He worked fast and clean, and within the hour, my line was back in place. Pressure test passed. Flow returned." I thanked him with a tip and watched as he snapped a few photos for the records, then drove off. I had a feeling those records wouldn't be kept in any official HOA file. But something else had been gnawing at me since this all started, something beyond just a garden hose or a busted pipe. Karen's authority wasn't just loud, it was unquestioned. The rest of the board barely blinked when she made declarations. The neighbors, even the ones who grumbled about her, kept their heads down. That's when I decided I needed to know more. I pulled out the land deed again. It wasn't just a single sheet, it was a map, a set of clauses, appendices, and surveyor signatures dating back over a decade. When my father sold the northern acreage to the developer, he included strict provisions. Among them, easement rights clause. The grantor retains full legal ownership and operational control of subterranean water access points, pump infrastructure, and primary distribution valves unless otherwise negotiated. Revocation clause: any interference, obstruction, or damage to said infrastructure by the grantee or its agents voids usage access until remedied at the grantor's discretion. That's what Karen had tripped over. That's what none of them understood. They didn't lease water rights, they borrowed them. And I was the lender. That afternoon, I made copies, certified ones. I brought them straight to the county recorder's office, had them reviewed, stamped, and uploaded to the official land access registry. Then I sent digital copies to every member of the HOA board, including the original developer, just for good measure. I didn't attach a message. The deed spoke for itself, but just in case Karen still didn't get the picture, I printed one final copy, slid it into a protective sleeve, and walked it down to the community center where the next HOA board meeting was already underway. I didn't knock. I opened the door and stepped inside like I belonged there, because I did. The room fell quiet. Karen was at the center of the long plastic table, flanked by Greg Wilkins and two other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Rows of folding chairs held maybe a dozen residents. Most of them turned when I walked in. Mason, Greg said, clearing his throat. "We weren't expecting. I won't take long," I interrupted. "Just dropping off some paperwork for the board." I walked right up to Karen, who hadn't spoken yet, her jaw tight as a clamp. "This," I said, sliding the folder across the table, "is the easement agreement your team violated. And this," I pulled out a second page, "is the revocation clause. In plain English, you cut my water, you trespassed, you damaged my infrastructure, and you did it without any vote permit or warning." Karen tried to interrupt. "That's a mischaracterization. No." I said loud enough for the room to still. "This is the truth, and it's now registered with the county. Any future interference with my system will be met with immediate legal action." Greg reached for the folder. The others glanced at each other. Karen said nothing. I turned to the room of neighbors watching me. For over a decade, I've maintained the system that gives this neighborhood water. Quietly, consistently. And I've never asked for thanks. But I will not be threatened or silenced while someone with a clipboard tries to carve up the rules to suit her ego. The silence was thick. Then one man clapped. Then another. And a woman in the back. I didn't wait for more. I walked out. Back home, I poured a glass of tea and sat on the porch watching the sprinklers pop back to life across the street. Little arcs of water danced across the lawns like nothing had ever gone wrong. But something had changed. Not just the water flow. The board knew now. Karen knew now. And I had the deed to back every word. The morning after the board meeting, the neighborhood felt quieter. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the cautious kind. People paused longer when walking their dogs past my yard. A few waved a little too enthusiastically, like they were trying to pick a side, without saying it out loud. Others just avoided eye contact altogether. I didn't blame them. The whole community had run under one illusion that the HOA ruled with absolute control. But now they knew there was a deeper infrastructure, one that didn't answer to the board or to Karen. And that infrastructure was me. Still, I wasn't here to make a spectacle. I was here to protect what was mine. And I had a feeling Karen wasn't done testing her limits. So I decided it was time to do something I hadn't done in almost 3 years. I went to inspect the main valve. The pump house sat at the bottom of my property line, just before the tree line started to thicken into wild brush and the land sloped down toward the retention basin. Most people didn't even know it existed. You had to walk a narrow path between my garage and a row of unkempt hedges past an old, wrought iron gate and down a gravel path that ended in a small utility building disguised to look like a shed. But inside, a full water control panel, 2 supply valves, a pressure regulator, an auxiliary flow meter, and a blinking panel connected to a flow sensor I installed myself back when this place first opened. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cool mechanical hum of the pump greeted me like an old friend. The walls were lined with simple analog gauges, all labeled in the handwriting of my father. I ran my fingers along the frame. Everything was intact, almost. The gauge for valve B, the one that fed the HOA side, was higher than usual. Not dangerously so, but unusual. I traced the pipe with my flashlight and noticed something that made me pause. A new clamp. Shiny metal. Fresh bolts. Someone had tampered with this side of the system. Recently. I checked the tag on the pressure bypass valve. It had been loosened manually. Not enough to damage anything, but enough to suggest someone tried to adjust flow output without logging it. I tightened it back into place. Whoever it was, they'd come here thinking I'd never notice. Or worse, that they were allowed to be here. They were wrong. I opened my maintenance logbook and wrote in bold ink, inspected HOA line. Signs of recent tampering, adjusted bypass, recommend adding secondary lock to panel. Then I did just that. I pulled out a small steel padlock from the drawer and attached it to the shutoff lever of valve B. Nothing fancy. Just a visible deterrent and a message. This isn't yours. This isn't Karen's. This belongs to the man who built it. As I was leaving the pump house, I heard footsteps crunching up the gravel behind me. I turned, expecting maybe Greg or even Chase again. It wasn't. It was Karen. She wasn't wearing her red blazer this time. She had on tight gray slacks and a tucked-in white blouse, and her hair was pulled back into a high, severe ponytail like she was ready to inspect an army. She didn't smile. She didn't pretend this was a coincidence. "You can't restrict access to the pump," she said flatly. "Already did," I replied, locking the door behind me and slipping the key into my pocket. "This infrastructure is shared under easement. That means the HOA has the right to monitor it." "No," I said calmly. "The HOA has the right to receive water, not to tamper with it, not to enter this structure, and definitely not to adjust flow controls." Her face twitched. "If you think you're going to use this system as leverage," "It's not leverage," I said. "It's protection. You cut my line, Karen. You capped it. You trespassed. You thought no one would notice because you had a badge and a clipboard." She stepped forward, lowering her voice like she was trying to keep the confrontation quiet. "I am the board." "Not anymore, you aren't," I said, holding up my phone. "I just sent footage of this conversation to Greg. You're on private property, again." She froze. And for the first time in this whole saga, she looked uncertain. Not angry, not smug, just lost. "You don't get it," she whispered. "These people, they let everything slide. Lawn codes, roof paint, solar panels. If I don't enforce it, it all goes to hell." I tilted my head. "So you attacked me for a hose." Her eyes narrowed, defensive again. "I enforce what matters." I shook my head slowly. "You enforce what feeds your ego. But this isn't your fiefdom. It never was." She stood there, shoulders stiff, breathing shallow. For a moment, I thought she might yell. But instead, she turned heels, crunching against the gravel, and walked back up the path without a word. Back inside, I reviewed the sensor logs. Whoever had adjusted the flow meter had done it just 2 nights ago after the board had voted to apologize. Karen hadn't been satisfied with a letter. She'd tried to reassert control by stealth. Now I had the proof. I copied the logs to a USB drive, along with my inspection photos, and emailed the entire package to Greg. Subject: unauthorized valve access. Security violation. I didn't demand anything this time. I didn't threaten. But I knew what this meant. Karen had crossed a second line. And this time, it was her own board that would have to decide what came next. It started with a hissing sound. A strange pressurized sputter that drifted across the lawns just after sunrise, subtle enough to ignore at first, but unmistakable to anyone who knew the sound of a broken irrigation system gasping for water. By 6:45 a.m., sprinklers on the east side of the block hadn't activated. By 7:10, the texts started. At 7:23, the HOA message board lit up. Urgent. No water pressure on Pecan Trail. Faucet's dead. Can someone contact Greg? My whole system's out again. And then, does this have to do with the pump station I was already up? Sitting on my porch, tea in hand, watching dew dry off the grass and hose bibs sit uselessly in the morning heat. My section closer to the original well was still running fine. I'd separated the flows late the night before. I'd waited until after I found the tampering logs, until after Karen trespassed again, until after I sent the proof to Greg. He hadn't replied, so now I was replying in kind. At 8:00 a.m., a small group gathered at the community fountain, Karen's pet project, of course, an unnecessary monstrosity of LED-lit water jets and faux stone basins that ran 24/7 to create neighborhood ambiance. Except now it was dry. The pond basin looked sad and shallow, filled with a few dead leaves and the reflection of half a dozen confused homeowners. I counted at least 3 board members among them. Karen was not one of them. Not yet. By 8:45, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Landon Gregg said over the phone, his voice tight. "We've got a problem." "You don't say." "Karen's whole end of the block has zero flow. The fountain's out. Half the residents are calling my personal number demanding answers." "I warned you," I said evenly. "Someone accessed my panel again without authorization. I showed you the logs. I sent pictures. The system showed a manual override 2 nights ago. I know no one has a key but me. But someone clearly found another way in." There was a long pause. Then Greg sighed. "Can you come down to the community center? Is Karen going to be there?" Another pause. "Yes, I'll be there in 30. When I walked in, the air was heavy. Karen sat stiffly at the board table, arms crossed, lips pressed so tight they looked white. Greg was pacing, trying to hold a clipboard while simultaneously answering questions from 2 angry residents. Cheryl, the assistant, kept wiping her glasses, pretending not to be part of the mess. Everyone turned when I entered. Karen didn't. "Thanks for coming, Mason," Greg said quickly. "Let's get right to it." I pulled a flash drive from my pocket and handed it to him. "Here's everything. Time-stamped logs, inspection photos, pressure readouts from the pump. Someone accessed the bypass valve again. Tried to spike flow to the fountain side. In doing so, they triggered the regulator failsafe, which shut down that line entirely to protect the system." Greg blinked. "Failsafe old design," I said. "Kicks in when a tamper threshold is breached. I added it myself. Never thought I'd need it." Now Karen looked up. "You're saying I caused the shutdown? I didn't even flinch." "I'm saying someone did. And the logs show the access came from a user with level 2 proximity credentials, same badge Karen uses for HOA property locks." Her jaw twitched. "Those logs are fake." Greg stepped in. "Karen Mason's system is standalone. It doesn't talk to the HOA network. There's no way he could spoof this." "I didn't touch the damn pump," she snapped. "You did 2 nights ago," I replied. "I have the sensor footage. You bypassed the hedges, used a flat tool to pop the maintenance panel, and tried to boost flow to your end of the block." Karen stood furious now. "You're spying on us. I'm protecting my infrastructure. You don't own this town, Mason." "No," I said calmly, "but I do own the water it runs on." A heavy silence fell. Even the residents seated nearby, most of whom I'd never spoken to, were watching now. A couple of them exchanged glances, murmuring under their breath. Greg looked around, then leaned into the mic on the board table. "I'd like to motion for an executive session closed board meeting, effective immediately." Karen turned. "You don't have that authority." "Yes, I do." Greg cut her off. "And the board seconds it." The other members raised their hands, 3 hands up. Karen still standing. Her face was red now. Her voice broke when she spoke again. "You're all cowards." Then she grabbed her bag and stormed out of the room, heels clacking like gunshots against the tile. Greg caught up with me afterward in the parking lot. "She's not going to let this go quietly," he said. "She doesn't have to," I replied. "But the water's not coming back to her block until the board issues an official ruling on her violation." He nodded slowly. "We'll review everything. The logs. The footage. If what you're saying holds up, it does. Then this might be the end of her. I raised an eyebrow. You say that like it's a bad thing. He didn't answer, but I saw it in his eyes, relief, uncertainty, and maybe even a little admiration. The kind of look people give when they finally realize the quiet guy at the edge of the block had all the power all along. That night, as the sun dipped low over the ridge, the eastern half of the neighborhood sat dry and silent. Hoses limp, lawns browning. The mighty HOA fountain cracked and bone dry. And in the middle of it all, Karen's perfectly manicured front yard now beginning to wilt one hydrangea at a time. Poetic, really. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it flows, or doesn't. It took less than 48 hours for the lawyers to show up. They didn't knock with pitchforks or lawsuits, not at first. No, this was a genteel ambush, leather briefcase, slick hair, a business card thicker than cardboard, and embossed with gold leaf. The man introduced himself as Raymond Park. HOA General Counsel, he said, like I was supposed to flinch. I didn't. He waited politely on my porch while I finished tightening a hose clamp on the irrigation system that Karen's people had so thoughtfully disrupted. When I finally stood and offered him a towel to wipe the sweat from his brow, he declined. I'll be brief, he said. I represent the HOA board. They've asked me to discuss a resolution regarding the ongoing utility disruption. You mean the water cutoff to the eastern block, I replied, tossing the wrench into my toolbox. Precisely. I gestured to a chair. Have a seat. He hesitated, then sat carefully, like the wood might be rigged to explode. Landon, he began slipping out a neatly stapled packet of paper. The board believes it is in the community's best interest to restore full water access immediately. In return, they're prepared to formally recognize your property rights and offer compensation for the damages caused to your personal line. How generous, I said, without looking at the papers. And what about the clause violations? The trespassing, the unauthorized valve tampering, he straightened. In exchange for restored water access, the board is requesting a mutual non-litigation agreement. No admissions of wrongdoing, no lawsuits. Convenient, I muttered. And what about Karen? Raymond paused. She's on leave. Voluntary. He gave the lawyer's version of a shrug. No movement, just a blink. There are internal matters I'm not at liberty to disclose. I let that sit in the air for a while. Then I reached down, pulled out a folder from beneath my workbench, and dropped it on the table between us. It was twice as thick as his packet, inside color printouts of every easement clause, every inspection photo logs from the water control panel, photos of the cut pipe, a notarized statement from Chase the contractor who'd fixed it, and screenshots of neighborhood posts blaming the HOA for the outage. Raymond opened it, brows lifting. I've also submitted copies to the county, I added, and to the state water board. He looked up sharply. You went to the state, I smiled. I like backup plans. To his credit, Raymond didn't panic. He closed the folder, sat back in his chair, and gave me a long, appraising look. May I speak candidly? By all means. The HOA underestimated you. That much is clear. They thought you were just an eccentric landowner with a grudge. I chuckled. Well, I am a landowner, and I do hold grudges. He leaned forward. If this goes public, if the board is found in breach of a utility easement, it opens them to litigation from every resident affected by the outage. Correct. And if you were to send a cease and desist to the HOA, demanding immediate disconnection from your infrastructure, then the entire community would have to pay to reroute a new water system, I finished. Millions in upgrades, 6 to 9 months of work, state approval, environmental review. It would collapse the HOA's budget before they even broke ground. Raymond exhaled slowly. You have them cornered, Mr. Landon. No, I said, standing and wiping my hands on a rag. Karen backed them into a corner. I just pointed it out. The next day, a second packet arrived. No more gold-embossed fluff. This one was from Greg Wilkins, typed by hand, signed in ink. The HOA formally recognizes Mr. Mason Landon as the sole legal owner and operator of the water infrastructure serving this neighborhood. The board acknowledges and regrets the unauthorized interference with his private systems and will adhere to the easement agreement henceforth. Furthermore, the board accepts Mr. Landon's right to suspend service in the event of future breaches. Effective immediately, the HOA board terminates Ms. Karen Wexler's position as vice chair. That was the moment the storm broke. It wasn't just the letter that sent ripples. It was what came next. Neighbors who'd barely waved at me before now stopped by to shake my hand. Some brought pies. One older woman, Mrs. Braxton, left a basket of peaches with a note that simply read, "Thank you for standing up. I hadn't meant to become some kind of local hero." But I wasn't about to turn it down either. Greg called later that afternoon. "We'll issue a public notice tomorrow. Karen's out. For good." "You sure she won't lawyer up?" She tried. But when we showed her the footage of her accessing the pump station, she folded. "Smart," I said. "For once." He chuckled nervously. "You think she'll retaliate? Not here," I said. "Not now." That night, I walked down to the pump house one last time. Not to shut anything off, not to check the gauges, just to look. The pressure held steady. The system hummed like it always had, faithful and quiet. I locked the door and ran my hand along the faded Landon pump station plate screwed into the wood. This wasn't just plumbing. It was legacy, and it was mine. The folding chairs were already out when I arrived. Neatly arranged in rows beneath the community center's overhang, they made the place look like a wedding reception if the bride had eloped and left behind a pile of HOA newsletters. Greg stood near the podium, fidgeting with the mic, nervously adjusting the Wexler out flyer someone had posted to the corkboard. The sun was starting to dip, casting long golden streaks across the pavement, and the crowd was growing fast. I counted at least 40 residents by the time I stepped up to the front. Families with toddlers. Older couples I barely knew. Young couples who just moved in and had no idea what HOA drama they'd walked into. They weren't here for snacks, they were here for clarity, and maybe for once, for change. Greg leaned in as I approached. "You sure you want to speak first? I need to," I said. "They've heard her voice long enough." He nodded and stepped aside. I took a slow breath, looked at the crowd, and began. "Most of you know me," I said, my voice steady over the mic. "I've lived here longer than the pavement under your tires, longer than the fountain, longer than the sign out front that says Stone Pines Community, a place to grow." There were a few chuckles, but I'm not here to give you a history lesson. I'm here to talk about what happens when power forgets its purpose, when a clipboard becomes a weapon, when a hose turns into a war. I paused, letting that hang in the air. What started as a violation over a garden hose ended with a water outage affecting dozens of families. All because someone Karen believed she could rewrite boundaries, physically, legally, morally. A murmur rippled through the audience. She cut my line. Trespassed, lied to the board, tampered with infrastructure. And when I responded not with vandalism, but with lawful boundaries, I was called disruptive, difficult. I held up a thick envelope. "This is the easement agreement signed when this neighborhood was built. This document is why water flows to your homes, because my family built the well, maintained the system, provided the infrastructure." I set the envelope on the table. This isn't about revenge. It's about respect, of property, of people, of limits. Something Karen forgot the moment she got a taste of power. I looked around, locking eyes with a few folks in the front row. You deserve to live in a neighborhood where no one has to fear citations for flowers in the wrong shade of yellow, or hoses that aren't aesthetic enough, or being shut down because they asked too many questions. A silence fell over the crowd, not heavy, not awkward, just aware. Then I said, "That's why going forward, I'm proposing 3 changes." Now they leaned in. First, I set a new committee. Not just the board will review all infrastructure concerns, especially those affecting property lines, utilities, and access rights. Any decision must have multiple signatures, not one. Several heads nodded immediately. Second, a permanent record of the pump infrastructure and easement history will be included in HOA onboarding paperwork. No more ignorance of the source that keeps this place running. Third, I looked at Greg, then back to the crowd. Any resident may request a public mediation hearing before a violation escalates. No more surprise notices. No more petty ambushes. Applause started not thunderous, but real. Grounded. A few people even stood. Greg took the mic after me. He didn't say much. just confirmed the board had accepted Karen's resignation and that her actions would be documented in the official HOA minutes. He also agreed to implement my proposals pending member approval. But no one voted against them. Not that night. After the meeting, neighbors lingered. Some shook my hand. Others told stories about citations they'd received in the past, threats of fines forced, removals of bird baths, wind chimes, even patio furniture. Karen had run the HOA like a petty kingdom, and no one had stopped her until now. Rosa Ortega, the woman who walked her schnauzer past my house every morning, hugged me gently. "You didn't just bring back the water mason," she said. "You brought back our dignity." That stuck with me. Long after the chairs were folded, long after the lights dimmed, even long after the last SUV pulled out of the lot and the street returned to its quiet, familiar rhythm. Back home, I sat under my porch light and watched the sprinklers arc quietly across my lawn droplets, catching the last orange light of the day. The fountain across the street was still dry, but it didn't matter. The source of power had shifted, no longer in secret, no longer silent. And this time it wasn't about control, it was about balance. It happened on a Wednesday. No fireworks, no marching band, no HOA newsletter proclaiming justice. Just a tightly packed meeting room, the usual lineup of lukewarm coffee in paper cups and a tension in the air so sharp it could cut through drywall. The agenda simply read, Board Meeting Item 3B Discussion and Action regarding board member conduct, but everyone in that room knew what it meant. Karen was going down. I hadn't planned on attending. After all, I'd made my point. The water was flowing. The neighborhood was speaking. And I was finally enjoying the rare peace of not being the target. But Greg called me the night before. She's still denying everything he said. Even with the logs, the footage, all of it. She can deny all she wants, I told him. The community already knows, I know. But we need closure, finality. The kind people remember. You want me there. I want them to hear from you one last time. So I put on my cleanest flannel, the one without the grease stain under the collar, and walked down to the community center. The room was packed. Not just board members this time. At least 60 residents spilling into the hallway. Some stood with crossed arms. Others leaned against the wall with folded agendas, watching, waiting. Karen was already seated at the board table when I arrived, her blazer ironed to perfection, a legal pad sitting in front of her, untouched. Her jaw was tight, her eyes unmoving. She didn't look at me. I didn't expect her to. Greg banged the gavel, meeting called to order. And just like that, it began. He ran through the motions first. Standard reports, budget adjustments, approval of minutes. The usual bureaucratic buffer. Then he cleared his throat and said, Item 3B. You could hear the whole room inhale. Greg looked directly at Karen. As of today, multiple members of this board have reviewed the compiled evidence of trespass system tampering and willful violation of HOA policy. We've also received a notarized statement from a licensed contractor corroborating the unauthorized capping of a private water line. Karen spoke before he could continue. This is a witch hunt, she snapped. None of this has been proven in court. You're all taking the word of a man who refuses to comply with our aesthetic standards. Someone in the crowd actually laughed. Karen's head whipped toward them, but she couldn't tell who it was. Let's be clear, she continued, her voice rising. I acted to protect the integrity of this community. Mason Landon refused to submit to compliance review. He defied the board. I stood then. Not dramatically, just firmly. The board, I said, does not own the land under my feet. It does not own the pipes, the pump, or the water it drinks from. And the integrity you speak of, Karen, has nothing to do with neighborhood standards. It's about power, the kind you abused. Greg nodded. Let's move to the vote. Karen's voice shook now. I will not step down. I was elected. And you can be removed, Greg replied. He turned to the other board members, all in favor of removing Karen Wexler from her position as vice chair and revoking her authority, effective immediately. 4 hands rose. Karen didn't move. Opposed only hers. Greg turned to the audience. By a vote of 4-1, Karen Wexler is hereby removed from the HOA board. The room didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The silence was louder than any applause. Karen stood slowly. Her hands trembled as she gathered her notepad, clutched her purse, and straightened her shoulders. She scanned the room one last time looking for allies. She didn't find any. When she turned to leave, her heels clicked in sharp defiance against the linoleum floor. But there was something different about her gait. It wasn't just stiff, it was hollow, as if something she thought she owned had been taken from her, because it had. Outside, the air was cool. Crickets chirped lazily. Porch lights glowed across the neighborhood like soft beacons. Greg joined me on the sidewalk. "She'll be gone by the end of the week," he said. "Already got a moving truck scheduled. She's selling the house," he nodded. "Too many complaints filed. No chance of re-election. She's toxic now." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked at the rows of homes she used to control, the lawns she used to inspect, the fences she used to measure. And now she was just another memory. Another reminder of what happens when power is misused. Greg turned to me. "You could run." "For what, the board? Chair even?" I laughed. "I'm better at pressure valves than people." He grinned. "You sure you've got more integrity than the last 3 board members combined? Exactly why I won't do it." When I got home, there was a note tucked under my doormat, handwritten. "Mr. Landon, thank you for standing up for all of us. For the first time since I moved here, I feel like this neighborhood actually belongs to the people who live in it. Your neighbor." No name, just the words. And that was enough. Because sometimes the loudest victories are the quiet ones. The kind where no one claps, no one cheers, and yet everything changes. The morning after Karen left the neighborhood felt lighter. It wasn't just the absence of her silver Lexus, or the lack of violation notices taped to door handles. It was in the way people walked their dogs without glancing over their shoulders. It was the quiet joy of kids running through front yards again, squealing as sprinklers arced high in the air, dancing like they were finally allowed to take up space. Freedom didn't come with a siren. It came with stillness and water. I walked down to the pump house just after sunrise. The air was cool, the kind that carried the scent of wet earth and dew. I brought with me 2 things: a new padlock for the outer gate, and a small hand-painted sign my niece had made the week before. It read, "Water flows here, respect the source." She painted it in blue and green with swirls and little waves. Childish, sure, but honest. I mounted it to the front of the shed just beneath the faded Landon pump station plaque my father had carved decades ago. Inside, the system hummed, gauges steady, no tampering, no spikes. Valve B, the one to Karen's former side of the block, was still closed. For a long moment, I just stood there, hand on the lever. The power to change everything sat beneath my fingers, but the anger I'd carried for weeks, it was gone. Drained like sediment from a cleared line. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. I turned the valve slowly. A satisfying hiss echoed through the pipe. Pressure climbed. Water flowed again, clean, steady, unquestioned. A few blocks away, faucets coughed to life. Hose bibs hissed. Toilets refilled. No announcements, no ceremony, just healing. I returned home to find a small group waiting on my porch. Rosa Ortega was among them, her schnauzer nestled under one arm. Beside her stood Jeff from 2 doors down, the guy who always wore cargo shorts no matter the weather. And a younger couple, Tina and Michael, I think, carrying a tray of coffee and a half-dozen warm muffins. We heard Rosa said softly. I raised an eyebrow. "Heard what that?" The valve turned back on. I chuckled. "News travels fast. You didn't have to do that," she said. "Not after what they put you through." "I didn't do it for them," I said. "I did it for the community." Jeff clapped me on the shoulder. "Damn glad you stayed, Mason." Tina handed me a muffin. "You ever think about running the board?" I nearly choked on my laugh. "Not in a million years." Michael grinned. "That's what makes you the only one we trust." Later that afternoon, I walked the block. Just walked. No clipboard. No citations. Just me taking it all in. Lawns were greening again. Sprinklers spun. The fountain, recently repaired by a few enthusiastic residents, burbled quietly, its LED lights finally removed. Kids on bikes waved as they passed me. One little girl pointed to a flower bed, blooming with wild daisies, and said, "Mommy, look, it's the nice man from the water." I smiled. That one stuck. I didn't rebuild the HOA. That wasn't my place. But I did attend the next meeting, just to listen, just to keep an eye on things. And when the board asked for feedback on how to rebuild trust, I said only this: Don't lead with control, lead with care. And never forget, you're not managing properties. You're serving neighbors. They wrote it down. That was enough. Weeks passed. Summer deepened. The neighborhood bloomed. And on one golden evening, as I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, the sound of sprinklers ticking rhythmically down the block, I allowed myself the rarest of moments. Peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't come from winning, but from restoring. From watching a community that once feared its own voice finally begin to speak and laugh and live again. And knowing deep down that the water would keep flowing. Because someone quietly, firmly had reminded them where it came from.